Welcome, everyone, to the Ecopsychology Café. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of this series. Monica Dragos and I co-created this program. I am standing on, living in the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq under the treaties of peace and friendship, and I invite all of us to acknowledge the people and the place on which we stand and live and reside. Today, we're going to learn about climate disinformation, and I invite Monica to introduce our guest speaker.
We have Jennifer Nathan with us. Jennifer has a science degree in biology and a master's of education degree. Early in her career, she worked for 10 years as a biotechnician and interpretive naturalist in northern British Columbia and the Yukon, and as the coordinator of a scientist in the schools program in the Yukon Territory. She subsequently provided professional development training to teachers on experiential science and was a teacher of high school science in BC. She is deeply engaged in climate issues, advocating for the inclusion of climate literacy in schools and engaging with her municipal government on transportation policy issues. So much, Jennifer, for being here.
Thank you. So I'll screen share. Okay, so can everyone see that? Okay, so just kind of leap into where I was a science teacher. So, you're teaching the scientific method, you're teaching about following the best evidence. And at the same time I was doing that, I was seeing the disinformation sort of in front of my eyes. I really am terribly worried that now the disinformation is the number one thing that's stopping the climate action to the solutions we need to keep us from getting overheating the world worse than it already is. It's now virtually certain that we've probably breached 1.5 degrees. I also want to start with the premise that the International Energy Agency came out with a report 2 years ago saying that if we really want to bring down emissions, there can be no new fossil projects. So we can't have any new pipelines, we can't have any new exploration. Oil and coal and gas all must be phased down. This was in 2022, so it should be happening now. So let's go back to, and you probably all remember this, when Inconvenient Truth came out. So feel free to, when if I ask questions, leap in, turn your microphones on and leap in. So Inconvenient Truth came out. I bought my own copy, showed it to students. At the same time, CBC had a program, Fit the State, on the denial machine. So they exposed, I thought very, very cleverly, how the climate disinformation was linked to the same playbook that Big Tobacco had. So all the money from Big Tobacco paid like fake doctors to that would say there's no link between cancer and smoking. Sometimes the same very, very pricey PR companies, and sometimes even the same scientists were now doing the climate denial thing. So does anyone remember what year the Inconvenient Truth came out? Anyone want to throw out a year? It
2000,
doesn't seem like that long ago to me. Anyone know? Monica, what were you going to say?
2006, I thought.
Exactly. So that is like 19 years ago now. So, you think that we would have become aware of the situation. But, at the same time in about 2006, I had students tell me, and again, I was teaching a climate change unit. So they actually had it in the BC curriculum for a few years before it was quietly dropped. But I had students tell me that they had their teacher tell them volcanoes produce more CO2 than people, which it only takes a few seconds to look up and disprove. So it's like, where was he getting his information from? So he was showing his students a documentary that came out to kind of combat Inconvenient Truth. And it's a British documentary called The Global Warming Swindle. British, but it included two Canadian climate deniers, Ian Clark and Patrick Moore. I don't know if you're familiar with Patrick Moore. His claim to fame is that he said he was one of the founders of Greenpeace, but he has spent his whole career, about 30 years, pushing fossil kind of or pollution-based industries. Very small group of people, wide influence. So we have some people from the States here. You're probably familiar with the Heartland Institute. So that is a very, very moneyed group in the States that were one of the authors of Project 2025, which Trump is probably now instigating. But they like to really muddy the waters. So people were getting familiar with the IPCC reports at that time. They came out with the NIPCC reports. They even stole the same font and layout. Features again Patrick Moore and Ian Clark. And they had enough money to send this climate disinformation stuff to every science teacher in the United States and college teachers. So the National Center for Science Education said, please throw it out. This is disinformation. Of course, under Trump, who knows what's going to happen to the National Center for Science Education. But we were not immune in Canada. So Canadian Geographic, they sound friendly, they sound good. So, and again, that time period, they were sending out this energy map to schools across Canada. Well, it turns out it was actually funded and worked on by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. And all these lovely lines on the map are pipelines. So it was really a pipeline promotion thing. But a lot of schools used it. And again, what Trump is doing in the States is not new. So I'm trying to teach climate change at this point under Harper. He was at that time laying off thousands of scientists, and he shut down climate research. And scientists that would go to a conference had to have a PR person with them and couldn't give out information to the public. If they'd done a study that had public relevance, it had to go through the government PR person first. So it was actually when Trump first got in, it was the Canadian scientists that helped them figure out how to rapidly archive their information before it was deep sixed. So for me, it was a tragic picture of a Department of Fisheries and Oceans entire library in Canada that was ended up in a dumpster. So it was very terrifying times. And also, Harper pulled us out of the Kyoto Accord, if you remember. So, so again, at that time, this is in 2014, CBC would have these people on that would say climate change is not a problem. I saw Kenneth Green on CBC. He's with the Fraser Institute. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. They get a lot of funding from oil interests. And I thought, again, the psychology of how can you go and say these non-truths to a public. So I wrote to him just as a, between classes and just said, I know you're kind of paid to give this disinformation, but what would you say to young people? If you came to my classroom and had to talk to them, what would you say? And he wrote me back. And it took me years to try and figure out why he said what he said. And but I think that that's kind of key, is understanding the talking points and like whipping the curtain off Oz and understanding the disinformation about it. So I'm going to kind of quickly walk you through. You don't have to read it. I'll interpret what it was he was saying. So the first thing he said is, I'm not objective, and he has to convince me to think more clearly. So if I'm not thinking clearly or objectively, it changes the agenda from the actual science to challenging my validity and even asking it. He said he had a doctoral degree. He reviews IPCC reports. Actually, anybody can review IPCC reports, so that was nothing special. And he had written a textbook for middle school students. So again, showing his expertise. I looked at his textbook. He said there's correlation is not causation. So CO2 does not warm the planet. If you look at peer-reviewed climate scientists, 100% of them disagree with that. So this has zero scientific validity. So then the question becomes, once you get a PhD, is there any obligation to your university to be truthful? So I remember asking a grade 7 student that, and she had to sort of really think about it, like, but that's so awful. But we talked about the doctors who said there's no link between smoking and cancer. So it's like, well, I guess you can. But if a PhD expert can lie, then how do you know who's the real expert? So just going back to his letter, he says climate change is real, modest, and manageable, so downplays the impacts. Again, since 2014, we know that that's not true. He said you can't trust models. So if you're teaching the models, which was part of my curriculum, you're not teaching science or sharing propaganda. So you've got to distrust climate models. They're faked and have no value. But this is from Exxon over 40 years ago, 45 years ago. And sadly, they are spot on for carbon concentration level. So 40 years later, they predicted we'd be at 420 parts per million. We are. So again, the predictive quality of this is quite terrifying if it continues on. He says climate policies will hurt, deprive, constrain, rip off our wealth, our choice, our joy, our travel, our education, or having fulfilling lives. So basically, our whole lifestyle would be rattled if we do a transition. So don't do it. And then the but Africa argument. So oil and coal and gas, and this is what we keep hearing, are cheap, reliable, affordable, and abundant. And they prevent, again, in Africa, polluted huts, grinding poverty, manual labor, health, education, disease, injury, refrigeration, clean water. So again, changes the agenda. So again, trying to come to grips with these talking points, you start to disarm them. This is a very common one that is used. He also said environmental groups have false promises of green energy. So it's not scientists wanting fossil fuels phased down, it's us radical environmentalists that alternative energies don't work and we should use fossil fuels with a clean conscience. So, I think breaking down these points again, we can disarm them. So he wrote this in 2014. He has zero legitimate science behind him. He's not really a journalist. Has he changed at all? We've had all these IPCC reports, all of this new information. We've seen the consequences of climate breakdown. And this is the scary thing is, and then just one quickly, is this disinformation or misinformation? Anyone want to leap in on that? So if he's doing it on purpose, so if he's purposely trying to do it, sorry, Monica, I think you were going to leap in on that, but this is definitely disinformation. He knows that this is not correct information. Someone who believes this and like retweets it or talks about it at the dinner table, that's spreading misinformation. They don't know this information is wrong. So again, Fraser Institute is another one of these kind of think tanks or front groups that take in a lot of oil money and will never change their opinion about whether fossil fuels are needed, that they're going to keep using that. And Kenneth Green, the person who wrote that letter, is in media across Canada all the time. This is just from the last year. So, we have to have more oil. I love this one. Ignoring climate-obsessed propagandists to enjoy summer. Net zero is not feasible. The gas cap is not good. We need more gas. We need more pipelines. The cap is not good. And then even in the last few months, he's had a bunch more. The next prime minister should swiftly dismantle the anti-energy agenda. Of course, renewables are energy as well. He really means anti-oil, but wants us to assume all energy has to come from fossils. So again, if you look at media, you think, oh, the climate is fine, but it's keeping us from our actions, and it's really got underlying messaging coming from these big money sources. So, we're really on the wrong track. How do we get off of this? So it's kind of like, again, going back to what's an expert? How do we know whether somebody with a PhD is giving us legitimate information or not? So I came up with the idea of like, well, let's look at, it's not really like Kenneth P. Green is going to keep saying the disinformation. The question is who's funding him? What media is giving him a voice? And how is it being used? So I had these deniers, so going back to Patrick Moore, who we showed at the beginning, and I just had clippings, and we had to come up with how does this connect to the front groups that are paying him, to the delay statements that they're making, to the politicians who quote them, to the media that puts that out there. So you can see from this that Patrick Moore was on Fox News, Fox and Friends. So he's saying, again, co-founder of Greenpeace, the whole climate crisis is not only fake news, it's fake science. There is no climate crisis. Weather and climate all around the world, carbon dioxide is the building block for all life. So Fox News carried the disinformation, and they are notorious, probably the #1 villain across the world for spreading disinformation about climate. Donald Trump saw that, quoted it on Twitter. So in fact, you could probably add Twitter up here as the spreader of disinformation for allowing that. And his delay statement is basically carbon dioxide is great for us. So when you start to make the links, you start to see the story. So I want to just walk through a couple of deniers, probably people you've never heard of, and yet their reach and the delay that they've caused is pretty stunning. So this is Susan Crockford. You can see that this picture was taken when she's speaking at the Heartland Institute. So they have a fake climate conference every year. And she's from Victoria and got a PhD in zoology, but she on wolves or something. But her shtick, her niche is polar bears. And you can see she gets a ton of space in Canadian newspapers. These are all post-media papers. And her thing is that polar bears are thriving. She's done no research, original research on polar bears. She's never been published in a scientific journal, but she has a blog and she gets retweeted and reposted everywhere. And again, out in the media. So polar bears are flourishing. If you care about them, you're a global warming alarmist. Was on a list as an adjunct professor at the University of Victoria. She didn't teach anything, but it gave her library privileges. And boy, it gave her sort of status that she used all the time. She writes reports that look very, very official. Victoria quietly dropped her from that list as an adjunct professor. So I don't know if you know, the Washington Times was actually started by the Moonies. They carry a ton of conspiracy theories. They said she was fired because she found polar bears are thriving despite climate change. And then I really want to draw attention to a group called DeSmog. If you haven't heard of them, they were started in Vancouver a very long time ago to bring attention to who these deniers are. And their journalism right now is top notch. So it's really a fabulous site. But they exposed that Susan Crockford was paid $750 a month by the Heartland Institute, by the denier group in the States. So again, the psychology is just way beyond me to grasp that she would do all this damage to the world for $750 a month. Just unbelievable. And so much damage that actual polar bear scientists were upset enough. 14 prominent researchers wrote an article in an actual journal, with a good reputation, Bioscience, that these wide followings on the denialist blogs are using bears to spread misinformation and the causes and consequences of climate change. So they had to actually go public to say that this was incredibly damaging. The New York Times wrote an article about their article in Bioscience. And the researchers singled out Polar Bear Science, a blog written by Susan Crockford, a Canadian zoologist, as the primary source of disinformation. 80% of these contrarian websites would quote her as their primary source. So if you just put polar bears are fine, you'll come up with a bazillion repeats of the information that she writes that is scientifically of no value. So again, small group of people, wide influence. This evidence board was done for Bjorn Lomborg. So I don't know if you know him. He was is a Danish economist. This one was done by a couple of high school students. So I used it because it was kind of fun to see how very, very quickly they loathed this man for the narrative that he was telling and put little devil horns on him. So his shtick is that as an economist, the price of acting on climate change is less than the impact of climate change. Just let it happen. We should just let the world get warmer. Where does he show up? Fox News. Not surprising. Again, devil horns on him as well. So if we just stopped using fossil fuels, billions of people would die. So the kind of But Africa thing that Kenneth P. Green, same kind of narrative. He shows up in the Wall Street Journal a lot. So then my question is, who owns the Wall Street Journal? Does anybody know who that's connected to? Same guy who does Fox News, Rupert Murdoch. So Rupert Murdoch is a climate denier. 80% of climate stories in the Wall Street Journal are disinformation on climate. And one of the biggest ones is Bjorn Lomborg. So, and again, the kids responded, "This man is disgusting, we're doomed." So they very, very quickly understood his narrative as being a problem. Still, he has a big voice. Bill Maher is a comic who has a show on HBO and I think CNN as well. And he had Bjorn Lomborg on as a guest. So climate change is a problem, the Danish political scientists told the comedian, but would only shave a few percentage points off global GDP by the end of the century. And in any case, he said, by then people would be much richer anyway. The immorality of this is just stunning. So, and again, he also, climate alarmism, we shouldn't be worried. Polar bears and coral are fine. It's the opposite. The 1.5 special report from the IPCC says that at 1.5 degrees, we lose like 95% of the coral. We're not in a good place on it. So this kind of relax, it's doing fine is a massive problem. So again, the New York Times had an article by Joseph Stiglitz, who is a respected economist, who did a review of Bjorn Lomborg's book that he came out with a few years ago called False Alarm, How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Doesn't Fix the Problem. And he said that Nordhaus, who's the one who said we could go to 2 degrees, and Lomborg's underestimation of the damage associated with climate change is a problem. They're not taking into account the risk. And our best estimates keep getting revised, typically in only one direction, more damage and sooner than expected. He said that the impacts on future generations, are ethically indefensible and economically nonsensical. So basically saying we should blithely accept a 3.5 or 4 degree world, which really in that case, billions and billions of people will die. That's an unworkable, obviously. And if you look at the list of experts on his Copenhagen consensus, which he's the head of, there are conservative biased economists, but no experts in climate science. So, and they keep sort of quoting the IPCC, but not explaining how worried those scientists actually are. So Stiglitz said, as a matter of policy, I typically decline to review books that deserve to be panned. But his work is downright dangerous were it to succeed in persuading people that there's any merit to his arguments. A little knowledge is dangerous. It's really about mind pollution. So, again, the kids picked out, the delay statements, humans will just be richer. We should just accept and move on instead of fixing it. But then they said, forgets to mention that quality of life won't exist if we're all dead. So it doesn't take much to inoculate young people against these delay statements if we can get at them, earlier. So as Mark Twain said, it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. Once they've gone down that path, kind of hard to pull them back. So just in Canada, again, post-media was where a lot of these people got a lot of airplay. So I don't know if you know, say if Polyev gets in and talks about defunding the CBC, then we're really only going to have these right-wing private media like Post-Media is Canada's largest newspaper chain in almost every city across Canada. They just bought Saltwire News on the East Coast, so Carol, in your territory. And they're owned by a U.S. hedge fund with ties to Donald Trump. So it's a huge problem. And the more we lose, I think they basically tell, there's a reason why you can access the stories without paying, because they're really kind of paid advertising for fossil companies all the time. But if you keep dismantling our media, then you really lose democracy. So it's not just Post-Media. This is a gas person who funded True North. So there's this whole whack of these little small papers that also give disinformation. So the Western Standard, I just want to point to, had an article yesterday saying net zero has arrived, but because our Canadian forests have done it for us, plant biology to the rescue. So they're saying that forests absorbed all of our emissions and more. We've achieved net zero. We should, really, China's the problem. So again, somebody else, not us. We've achieved net zero. We don't need a carbon tax. I looked at their science link. It went to Friends of Science, which is the Canadian equivalent of the Heartland Institute, has zero scientific, and honestly, anyone who knows that a Canadian forest, we think of us as a forested country, is a carbon source, not a sink anymore. And the forest fires, that bad year we had, put out more than double all of our emissions from every sector in Canada. So again, the opposite. So all of this media, I love this. I think this was in Britain. Polite notice. Customers are reminded that these newspapers are merely the opinions of a small group of billionaires desperate to influence public opinion and are not 100% factually reflecting reality. Please cross-reference everything you read. So I think we should put these out everywhere. Again, most of the media that people interact with are owned by billionaires, and the messaging is getting more and more muddled all the time. So Hannah Arendt, who came up with the banality of evil, said this constant lying is not aimed at making people believe a lie, but at ensuring no one believes anything anymore. A people that can no longer distinguish between truth and lies cannot distinguish between right and wrong. With such a people, you can do whatever you want. So I think that's a little bit of what we're getting to now, to the point where politicians, this is the political party ruling in province of Alberta, just pledged to abandon the net zero targets and remove CO2 as a pollutant. So they said we have to celebrate it. The more we have, the better. So, and then I'm glad David is here. I just want to say this has now infiltrated at the political level, and probably always has, where David, who has had the amazing ability to take all of the science reports and UN reports, and has been on several parliamentary committees to tell the truth on the science. And both times he's gone up against like Fraser Institute people who are introduced as a prof from a university, and we're not told that they are with the Fraser Institute or whatever group they're in. In this case, he went up against Dr. Heather Exner-Perot, who was with Macdonald Laurier. So again, a kind of think tank with a fossil bias that will never talk about the truth on fossil fuels. So when she was talking about subsidies, she said hydrocarbons are a gift to our wonderful way of life. That we need to have a climate war, not a culture war. Oil and gas are not the enemy. That developing nations need access to cheap energy. So again, it's the same but Africa story. And yes, so the magical molecule of hydrocarbon has positively impacted our lives. So all kind of BS on oil and gas. And then David is trying to explain, if we want to stay within 1.5, this is a few years ago, the carbon concentration level must be kept below 430. The present rate of increase is going to happen by 2028, and now even sooner. So he was asked, what's it going to take for us to move more quickly? So that's the great vexing question. David said it's the heart of our extraordinary dilemma. Why have we not acted sooner? So I might say no one's saying shut down oil next year, but as I showed at that graph at the beginning, oil must come down, even oil must come down 25% by 2030. I'm going to put it to you this way. For children who are 5 or 6 years old now, and we all know some of them, by the time we're in grade 8, it's going to be too late for them to reverse the path that we're on. That's how bad it is. I put it that way because I think that conveys the absolute, oops, I can't see the word, problem of where we are now. We're in this situation because we didn't act 10 or 15 years ago. I can't think of a better way to answer your question. So, you know, we put CO2 out there. You can't take it out. It's going to be there. It's going to make it worse. They're talking about ice in the Arctic. We might have an ice-free at least one day in the next few years. And that just has these tipping points that will put us in a worse situation. But again, Heather Exner-Perot has a much bigger voice, sadly, than David, and she gets all of these media stories out there all the time, a trillion reasons why we need the oil sands for our economy. What the crisis now with tariffs from the States, what are you seeing all over the place? We need new pipelines. Pipelines, pipelines, pipelines. Again, that's the wrong pathway. So some good news is that for our kids, and the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment just came out with this, I think, yesterday, um, leading people to understand how fossil fuels have influenced children's education, as I talked about earlier. You probably might have heard of Earth Rangers. Did you know they get a ton of fossil funding, and that influencing their messaging, that we have to balance our understanding of fossil fuels? Seeds Connection has fossils on their board. So it exposes the kind of messaging where we're told to have a balanced approach. It's not that it changes you make individually, that kind of thing. This also just came out in January, the state and spread of climate disinformation in Canada. They talk about these 5 narratives. The claim that pushing for climate change action, we are elitist, hypocritical, and thus illegitimate. 67% of Canadians will fall for that. When I first did this workshop, I was called elitist. I'm like, what? So again, it's become a bit of a culture war, our climate fight. The idea that other countries, but China, so the but China argument, they do more than us, we don't have to do anything. Renewables are unreliable. The ethical oil argument, you hear that all the time. Nothing could be further from the truth if you actually go to their site. And the horrible thing that Indigenous participation in fossil fuel extraction is part of reconciliation. You hear that argument all the time as well. 40% of Canadians will accept that. So I think exposing these talking points is allows us to defang it. So encourage you to really push for climate education in schools. Part of the Paris Agreement is that Canada do that. Desmog, skeptical science, science feedback are all good sources of debunking all this stuff. I'll send you links for this. And I'm not sure how we're doing on time. Is it okay to, I just want to show quickly, end up with, I saw this in our local paper, the climate crisis, what is happening? Join us for an illuminating evening of scientific presentations and a panel of experts, there's that word again, to answer your questions. And I'm like, oh, there's another climate group out there. Cool. And then I looked up this CAT BC and found out it's an anti-vax group, and that they were showing this documentary. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting, because remember I started talking about Global Warming Swindle, the British documentary? Well, this is the same guy featuring the same fake scientists, came out this year. It has, this in March last year, they said it had 1.5 million views on Twitter and 1 million views on YouTube. And I'll just play this very quickly. Here's Patrick Moore, the one I started at the beginning, explaining that, and that Trump retweeted.
As a climate emergency happening on this planet now. There's no evidence of one.
And then Canada features in the last minute of the documentary. So again, how they flip the story to make it not about the science, but a culture war. So I'm going to show you the last minute of the documentary.
Well, they underestimate it with the fury that this would meet with ordinary people who just say you can't do this, and you suddenly get this new movement.
Can I hear it? So if you couldn't If you couldn't hear that, I hope you read the words, but it's sort of the craziness of the narrative and how it has moved to. So, climate change is serious. It's urgent. We're far away from getting where we need to be, but it's not about the science anymore. It's about political will. So, disarming this disinformation is really key. We need literacy education at every level, workshops on the disinformation, pressure the Ministry of Education in your province or your country or your state. We need to ban fossil advertising, just like they banned cigarette advertising. Huge thing. CAPE is doing a lot of work on that. And you cannot get this information in a court. So we need to support the legal cases. There's a Canadian children's legal case, an Indigenous climate case coming up in Canada. You can zoom in on them. I think if we do that, we can bring attention to the actual science. We are intimidated by those talking points of disinformation, but we can be intimidating ourselves. So I just want to end with a little positive note. The city of Vancouver banned gas in new builds, but a couple of fossil interests were fighting to get it back. So it looked like they were going to bring gas back into new builds. When they had the council meeting, kids did no more gas, keep gas out of our buildings. And the councillors who supported this put those kids' posters in front of their desks. Well, a lot of gas interests showed up at that meeting, saw the signs and said, you need to take those down. It's intimidation. And it worked. So they actually voted to support keeping gas out of new builds because we have the moral weight on our side, especially children, especially young people. So we need to bring all our intimidation out there. So I hope I haven't gone too long. I really thank you for listening to this. Hopefully we can start to crack this horrible situation. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was absolutely fascinating. Would you like to stop share your screen so we
Yes,
can
thank you.
enter conversation? Thank you. Monica, do you have any comments?
Not at the moment.
Yeah, I'm kind of stunned as I'm an educator and I actually teach teachers. And it's like, how do you go down this road safely? Yeah, I look forward to some of the resources you're going to be sharing in our follow-up email. Yeah. Anybody have any questions or comments? Who's got their hands raised here? Oh,
Travis? Yeah.
Yeah, so first, Jennifer, that was fantastic. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. I'm in the United States. Well, actually, I'm in
You're in
Alaska.
Alaska.
I
Yes.
don't know what that counts as these days. But it was really interesting to see it from the Canadian side and just to see that pretty much all the things that are happening in Canada is a mirror image of what's happening in the US, the nationalism, everything else. Um, First off, I wanted to ask if the teaching resources you use, if you could make those available, I'd love to see what you're doing through students. I love the connect the dots stuff. One thing though, I wanted to mention that I think is another really important thing to address. This is another major source of disinformation we're seeing is climate doomism, where people it's often distributed by groups that claim to be environmental groups who are basically saying it's too late, there's nothing that can be done, and try to paralyze people with fear. And I've noticed in my own students that this is the biggest issue I'm facing is overcoming this doomism. It used to be students didn't know a lot about climate change and were curious to learn. Now they don't want to talk about it because they think it's hopeless. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do, and that's part of why I'm part of this group, is help them to see what can be done, to see the solutions, and also have optimism that they can be part of that. And so I don't know if you're doing any things to help engage students as far as getting them interested in being part of the solution. Are you doing anything like that?
Well, I actually retired from the classroom to do climate work. So I haven't been in the classroom myself, except that Karen, who's here today, we go in and do units for students. But we use a lot of the information from Drawdown on solutions. So we talk about how we have the solution. We don't have to go this pathway. There is another pathway. It's scientific. It works. We can bring down emissions by switching to heat pumps, things that are far more efficient, active transportation, fund transit. The answers are all there. Stop eating so much meat. But we have to contextualize it around the interests that are trying to stop those solutions. So let students know the solution. And I went into a middle school class and said, I'm here to make you angry, and told them about all of this powers that are trying to stop everything and the really dumb conspiracies that come out of it. Well, they really latched on to the 15-minute city conspiracies. Remember that the sort of, they're going to lock us into and blah, blah, blah. And, but they started researching 15-minute cities, and then actually ended up going to our city, New Westminster, to make this proposal that we use that as a lens for city planning in our city. And it passed, and it's now our overarching lens for city planning. So kids can have a voice. And that's middle school kids. So, you have to sort of learn what the solutions are, learn about what's opposing those solutions, so that you realize the power you have to disarm that and push for those solutions, because they aren't going to just happen. We really need to be actively engaging. And I think, of course, we don't have the solution, because nothing has been sort of pushing us towards climate action from what we've been seeing. So we can't say, do this and this will work. But I think there has to be a bit of a combination of hope with the truth of getting us a little bit angry about, personally, Patrick Moore, Lomborg, their arguments, just like the kids saw, are so awful and so stupid. Why do they have a voice and that power? We need to disarm that very, very quickly by teaching that when they're younger, so that we can move to those solutions much faster and don't get muddled by the noise. Does that make any sense?
No, that's great. I mean, that's amazing. That's fantastic that you've been able to energize students that way. One thing I just added in the chat, and I'll shut up after this. I worked with a professor at my university, a journalism professor, to create an activity where to develop students' science media literacy skills to be able to assess whether or not these articles, and it talks about a lot of things you talk about, like what's the news source, who's writing about it, what else have they written about, and I shared a link in to it in the thing. It's in the context of just science media literacy in general, and we use it in all of our classes. And then, of course, when it comes to climate change, then hopefully they'll be using these skills for that too.
The other thing is that the solutions create such better communities. Like, if we decar our community and have more active transportation, they say that if you walk or bike to work, you get that same kind of adrenaline feeling you get when you fall in love, so every day you've got that kind of lovely, energized feeling. Who wouldn't want that? You're healthier too if you do that. So, I was just in a community that had fabulous bike lanes, and I would bike every single day. If I know Alaska, I even know someone in Whitehorse who bicycled all winter. So it is possible. But, if you build it, they will come. And, but you have to support it with actual information. Anyway, I'll stop. Ashley, do you have a question?
I lived in Yellowknife where they have fat bike races in the middle of the winter.
Winter.
So it's definitely doable. Um, yeah, I'm kind of reeling, to be honest. David, shout out to you, but that quote about like 5-year-olds by the time they get into grade 8, like there's no way to rewrite the path that we're on. I have a 5-year-old. So that one kind of hit home. And yeah, I'm wondering, how do you balance that without dipping into doomism? Like, how do you keep the hope alive when that is the reality of it? Also, I would really love if you could share that quote with me so I could blast all these pro pipeline people on LinkedIn with it. Somebody called me a citizen last week. I don't know how that's yeah.
So, David, did you want to leap in there?
Well, I actually, You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a rare opportunity to talk about this subject at about as good a level as you can get in Canada. That's a parliamentary committee. Now, the problem with the parliamentary committees is they're more performative. The politicians are there, and of course, there's no filtration on who gets the politicians invite the witnesses. So I was invited actually by the Quebec Separatist Party, who are a very interesting group in Canada because they take this issue really seriously. So that's how I got there as a witness. The other witnesses are being invited by the majority parties, and they hold 10 out of 12 seats on that committee. And so you get this opportunity to speak, but then they generate reports at the end of the day in the back room, and they leave out the quote, right? The majority they write the report. So we are frustrated right now in the political process of how to bring this discussion to that highest level. The parliamentary committees are one entry point, but they are immensely frustrating in that way. And as far as the statements bordering on doomism, that is the most we have to be speaking of the truth. But I was very interested in what Travis said about that tilt towards doomism and the dangers of it. And that's where modes of expression are really important. How we talk about it is so important. And it's a delight to hear Jennifer speak on this subject. But I'm delighted to meet you in this way. But I think that the actual language, we have to be very thoughtful and disciplined in how we present the story. That's all.
Well, we're going to send in the follow-up link essays that David has written that are just beautifully written and putting the reality of where we're at as well. So.
And this is the thing that is hard for me. Like my whole song and dance is climate education and communications, and like how we delightfully sugarcoat things, but yet we have scientists that are lighting themselves on fire, like, big government steps. And I battle with this, like, this idea of what truth is. Like, how do we encourage people and help them understand where we're at without, like, with sidestepping doomism, but being actually transparent and not sugarcoating it. Like the whole, we can get through this if we only work together goes so far, but how do you get people to work together in a specifically polarized time without saying, hey, if we don't work together, then this will happen, and not go right into reverting to doomism. Like I got 3 children from 5 to 11, and this is the dance I do all of the time. And I'm like, just wondering how we do this, like still remain ethical, but remain truthful to the realities of what's happening.
I mean, if you think about how did you get people to stop smoking? It's an addictive, horrible thing. And it was everybody when I was young, everybody smoked on airplanes, ferries, everywhere. And it was educating the kids who educated their families and educated their communities. So I think pushing for climate education is probably one of the fastest ways to change communities. So, but let's go. Rebecca, you had a question?
Yes, hi. What a wonderful presentation, Jennifer. Thank you. I'm down in the US and New Mexico, and I'm kind of like stunned about the level of disinformation on climate in Canada. I was kind of rattled by your presentation, but I was to know that you're doing that work and that you guys up north, are so conscious of what's happening up there. My question, see if I can formulate this into a question. Down here, well, first, my apologies to Canada on behalf of like the United States. It's like, oh my God, really, I'm so sorry that this regime has taken over. It's like a regime and it's autocracy. And so this leads into my question. Right before this, I was just listening to a podcast, the radio from NPR, which is our national public radio, Fresh Air, which is a wonderful program, and she was interviewing a writer, Anne Applebaum, who's for the Atlantic, and her new book is called Autocracy Inc. And I've been starting to read about this. You know, we have Musk now just digging in and taking over basically all the government computers. Is to well, and I kind of made this connection just waiting to get on this call that the disinformation is bigger than the fossil fuel industry. It's the tech industry. And since this regime has come in, you know, we've those of us who are trying to learn and read are becoming aware of how the tech bros really are manipulating this whole system to gain this power, and like what is their end game, and that I feel almost like, you know, it's this link between fossil fuel industry and them, and you know how much AI, you know how much power AI needs and these kind of things, and then the push to, I don't know, like probably mine Mars and those kind of things. So I was feeling like more discouraged, like, whoa, it's this huge system. But I'm curious about making this link between our movement, you know, here with climate change, and then really becoming conscious of like how the disinformation happens, because now they have control over all the social media and all of that. Well, to some degree they do. So I'm just wondering if there's anybody talking about how to link those two together. I'm very interested in the psychology of how people get taken over by that disinformation. That's probably a whole other presentation, but
Isn't that like, yeah, the hardest to understand thing is not only the people who go down the rabbit holes, but the people that give out the disinformation. What is their psychology? Like Susan Crockford, $7.50 a month to sell us down the river. Like, what is their end game? I heard Naomi Klein speak last week, and she said that she thinks Elon Musk really does understand that climate is an end game kind of thing, that don't think he doesn't understand this, which depresses me to think that they do know they're leading us off the ends of the planet. I think, though, that a lot of this disinformation was more subtle. So before, but now with Trump, it's exposed. It's out there. There's no question of the pathway he's put us on. You know, the fact that he's getting rid of legitimate media at his pressers, but bringing in bloggers or influencers. Like now, I think it has, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's unleashed a kind of, a kind of a complacency that people were in, and they're now that people are really understanding, we need to fight for our democracy. So and seeing those ties, it's not that it's really, climate change is just a symptom of our greater problems, and that the more we can sort of expose this craziness, that the more people are fighting back. So, you know, I hope, I don't know. It's, but it's again, I think pushing for climate literacy and talking about the talking points. You know, it took me a long time to understand what Kenneth Green, like why he was writing what he was writing and how to disarm those talking points. Like when I showed his letter to students, it was like, do you want to write back to them? And they just looked at me blankly. So unless you walk them through why they're saying what they're saying, what is their motivation, it's very difficult to disarm it, I think. So I don't know. I just think we need to talk more and more and more and more about how what these sources are, how they're funded, and what their motivation is.
yeah, yeah. And you know, we did have a big march, well, it's all over the US yesterday on President's Day. I put it in quotes. And I did go down to our state capital. I'm in New Mexico. But you know, New Mexico, we're very blue, but we also get most of our funding for education is from oil and gas. So there's a whole thing about that. But there were a lot of young people at the march, and there was a lot of young trans people, a lot of young, we've got some really good young climate activist groups here in New Mexico. So it's just like cheering them on and thinking, wow, what kind of future do they have? But those educational links are really interesting and shocking. Of course, we have that here too, that, you know, the textbooks are all printed and given out.
It's shocking what I read about. I think there's 6 states now that, you know, PragerU is not a university. It's one guy who has Patrick Moore saying climate's not a problem. And all of his resources have been approved to show to students in like 5 or 6 different states. So you're now getting Yes, exactly as you say, fossil interests on doing this, the textbooks and on the school boards and promoting disinformation within the schools. Now, we're not safe, Rebecca, in Canada. In BC, a person got very close to being elected premier of our province who had in his platform that he would ban the teaching of climate education in schools. So, and he almost became our premier. So, and he got kicked out of one party for tweeting Patrick Moore, a denier quote that CO2 is good. And yet he almost had control. So, if we don't push and support climate education now, we may lose the opportunity to do that